Hello and welcome back to HEMA Fight Breakdowns. Today I'm going to be doing the third place longsword match between Jonas Bürgi and Steffen Warner at the London HEMA Open 2025. This was a pretty interesting match. I would say maybe a little bit more interesting than the gold medal match because we had a slightly more even competition, although the points don't necessarily reflect that. There's a lot more interesting exchanges going on here. There's a lot more back and forth and adaptation on both sides, and we get to have a fun little discussion about back of the head scoring and left Zverks. So, let's get started. So, starting us off with our first exchange, we don't really have that much of a preliminary feeling out period. Instead, Jonas comes in with a big thrust right off the bat. He gets parried, pushed off to the side, and at this point, we see a little bit of a critical mistake from Steffen. Basically, he gets the parry off of the initial thrust, goes for one single action as a repost, and then freezes for a second. And this is actually somewhat common in the world of HEMA and fighting overall, which is that sometimes when you feel like you've landed something, you take a bit of a second, or maybe like a half second, to try to comprehend what has exactly happened and what you should do next. And the problem is that second of calculation often comes off as hesitation. So when Jonas comes in with his thrust and it does get parried, Steffen throws his one parry riposte style technique. It gets parried in turn and he gets jammed up. And at this point, he starts to freeze and Jonas gets basically two actions for free. The second they go up into this wound up position, Jonas initially tries to go for a two-handed pommel around the side, which doesn't work because his front hand is kind of just getting in the way of finishing the technique. And then, realizing that he can't do that, he pivots around and throws a right Zverk to the arms. By the time that right Zverk has pretty much already landed, Steffen then realizes, oh, the fight's not over and my riposte didn't really land properly, or at least the judges didn't see it. And now he has to go for a follow-up technique that just basically amounts to nothing more than going out of his high right position and then throwing a little bit of a cut across the middle. So obviously the initial thrust did not land and the Zverk in the follow-up did land. But if you really want to learn something from this, that's these freezing style scenarios that a lot of people find themselves in is definitely something that you need to break as a habit. And more importantly, the only way to really break it is to always fence to the halt. Something I've talked about in other videos, but sometimes you throw things that the judges don't see. Sometimes you land things that the judges can't see. And the worst thing that can happen is for you to land something, think that you land something, know that you landed something, and then stop fencing. Because at this point, you open yourself up not only to an afterblow from your opponent, but it also means that if the judges missed it, you are also giving them that afterblow for free. It's not something that you want to do. And while it sometimes sounds a little crazy and a little shitty when you say it this way, you need to always keep fencing until someone tells you to stop, because you never know when they're going to miss something obvious or when someone's going to do something that they're not supposed to do. You're going to feel a hit, they're going to freeze, and you're the one who didn't take advantage of that opportunity. We go now into our second exchange, and this one actually has much more of a feeling out period as before. This time, there is a lot more distance work, there's a lot more timing work, and we see something from Steffen that we haven't seen yet, which is him trying to leverage his length and superior height to try to go for little tippy-tappy shots on the outside. There's an opportunity there where he takes a little bit of a lunge forward, and he tries to snipe the knee of Jonas, who manages to get out of the way. But, of course, as I say every single time this happens, these are the shots you want to go for, because despite the fact that Jonas was able to get out of range and not get hit, he wasn't able to respond appropriately to that threat. And what that means is that if you have the ability to threaten your opponent and they don't have the ability to threaten you back, you've got a win-win situation for you. You win if you land it, and you win if they have to move out of range and completely reset, because now you can just do it again. But that's not what ends up happening. Instead, Steffen goes for a big ballistic thrust. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Steffen is the taller person, which means he has the longer range, and it actually makes a lot more sense for someone like Steffen in this matchup to be going for the big ballistic thrusts. However, it once again does and doesn't quite work out for him. When you watch the slow-mo footage, it actually seems pretty clear to me that Steffen's thrust does land right here into the upper neck, shoulder kind of area, but then glances off as a result of the blade being flexible. However, the judges don't see it, and this is again where we have to get into the realm of freezing. Now, Steffen doesn't freeze when he thinks he lands his thrust. He does anything but. He continues to go forward, and he crashes into his opponent. However, His opponent did a very smart thing here, which is after they theoretically set their thrust off to the side, they threw a big, heavy left Sverk to the head. And these are really, really good motions to do when someone is crashing into you for a couple of key reasons. One, the left Sverk, when you're right-handed, pulls your hands close to your head. And this makes it very, very good for dealing with people who are getting into grapple range with you, because it means there's always a bit of blade in front of your body. The right Sverk, when you're right-handed, conversely has your arm out in front of your body, meaning that if you try to throw a right Sverk when someone's coming in at you, chances are your right arm is going to get stuck on them and you're not going to be able to throw that Sverk properly. However, if you throw a left Sverk, your right hand is going to be pulled back, your left hand's also going to be pulled back, and there's a better chance that if they try to reach out and grab your hands, they're just going to hit the sword, and if they, as Stefan did, lean forward with their head's going to get hit. So it's a great thing to try to do. However, this is where we have to start talking about A, back of the head, and B, proper defense after you miss a thrust. I've said it before on the channel, and I'll say it again here. Whenever you miss a thrust, it's grapple time. You really don't have a choice. In order to throw a proper thrust, you have to commit past your target, which means that if you miss a thrust, you are, by definition, going to put the tip of your sword past your target. And that means you're in a situation where you have a lot of forward momentum. They might have a little bit of forward momentum, or at least they're standing still. And even if they're moving backwards, at the end of the day, you're probably going to be moving forward faster than they're moving backwards, which means you're going to end up in a situation where your hands can touch. And if you're in a situation where your hands can touch, you should be grappling, because oftentimes in a grapple, the first person to realize that they can do it is going to be the one who wins the grapple that subsequently happens. So in this situation, Stefan throws his big thrust. He misses his big thrust. I mean, technically he doesn't, but according to the judges, he did. And at this point, he does not do the appropriate grapple maneuver that he needs to in order to protect himself from the left Sverk that is inevitably coming. What he needed to do was to do the Stephen Chaney hand push. And if you don't know what that is, it's actually very simple. When you miss a thrust, both hands are on your sword, you're kind of extended like this. You simply take both of your hands and you shove it towards the face of your opponent. Why? Well, for one, if they do the right Sverk, as we talked about earlier, they're going to get stuffed up. But even if they do the left Sverk, part of the issue with throwing your hands toward your opponent's face is that, A, you might just get that pommel strike. That generally doesn't happen very much, but you never know. But two, what happens is anytime you need to throw a Zverkow, which is a great anti-grappling maneuver, you need to move your hands from one section of your head to another section of your head. That's regardless of whether you're doing a left Sverk or a right Sverk. And if you put your hands into the face of your opponent and push them back a little bit, you are going to be in the path of the rotation of that Zverkow. So when you do this, you miss that thrust and you shove your hands into their face, you're going to be in a situation where at the very least, your arms are going to be between the sword and your head, and you're either going to get a lower priority hit on yourself, or B, you're at least not going to get hit on the back of the head. Now, we're going to talk about this a little bit more in some other exchanges, but for now, I'm going to leave it at that. So, for our first exchange, yes, I did skip the third exchange, we have to talk a lot about back of the head protection and what you can and can't do in order to get this to happen or not happen. So in this exchange, we have a pretty simple one. There's a little bit of an exchange of probing strikes, but then at some point, Stefan on the right here goes in for a deep cut. He gets parried off to his left side, Jonas's right side, and then gets meanly Zverked in the head, which of course, due to the position he put himself in, is the back of the head. Now, why did this happen? Well, one of the things about being a right-handed fencer is that the one thing you absolutely never, ever, ever want to have happen to you is for you to get parried off to your left side, the opposite side. And there's a really important reason for this. When you are right-handed and you extend your arms at full extension, you are trying to stay in the center. If you then get pushed off to your left side, what happens here is that both of your arms, and most importantly your right arm, gets dragged across your body. When you are fencing and your right arm is forward and your right leg is forward, and then your right arm gets dragged across from your right to your left, what happens is it turns your shoulders and it turns your hips. And both of those things combined together puts you in a situation where chances are, even if you feel like your head is perfectly anchored to your body, you actually have to do a lot of work to make sure that you're not exposing the back of the head. This then compounds with the fact that the common follow-up after getting parried off of a thrust, or at least just parried off to that side, is that you're going to try to throw a right Zverk. a right zwerg, which of course requires you to then continually turn your right hips and your right shoulders even more to your left in order to power the blow. The result, of course, is that this very common situation where people end up accidentally exposing their own back of the head to a blow that they pretty much already knew was coming. So in this exchange, Steffen goes in. He gets parried off to that left side. That is the worst place you really just don't want to be, and then gets zwerged in the head. So what can he do to try to A, defend the back of his head, and B, try not to end up in this situation again? One of the key important factors here is A, never throw a strike onto the left side of your body, aka if you're right-handed, don't throw left Oberhaus unless you have a bailout plan. Because if you throw a left Oberhaus and you get parried, you're going to be parried on that bad side again. And that's not a situation you want to be in. Throw it to the hands, throw it to the legs, throw it somewhere where you're not going to get strong parried. Try not to throw it to the head wherever possible. But if you really want to do it anyway, the next thing you need to make sure of is that the second you get parried on that side, you want to disconnect your hands and shove your right hand up to your top right quadrant. Why? Because as I've said before, when you miss a thrust, you're going to be in Grapple Town. And when you're in Grapple Town, the first person to realize you're there is probably the one who's going to win. So if you're the first person to disconnect your hands, take your left hand, start shoving it towards their sword. Take your right hand, start shoving it towards the place where you think you're going to get hit. Chances are you're going to be okay. And most importantly, this is a completely different decision than trying to throw a right zwerg, which is, as I said earlier, is a very common decision that people make. The problem with throwing a right zwerg after you've been parried onto your left side is that you have to continually rotate your body, and you're probably going to expose the back of your head. So by not doing that, you are not going to expose the back of your head as much. But let's say that instead of wanting to do the sensible thing and not throw left Oberhaus to the head, and you really don't want to do the sensible thing of just grappling the second you get parried there, you still want to throw your right zwerg, there is still something that you can do about it. And that is to try to take a compass step or an offline step toward your right past your opponent's left leg. This is an important factor not only for making sure that you're not exposing the back of your head, but it's also going to help you land your right zwerg better. The problem is it requires you to pretty much know you're going to get parried right as you're going in the first place. So take this scenario as an example, but deviate it a little bit in your mind. Steffen comes in with that big left attack. He gets parried off to his left side. You can see what he does with his right foot in the slow-mo footage here, and he shoves it straight towards his opponent. He pretty much didn't have a choice because of how much momentum he had going forward. But if you imagine that he instead took a 45-degree angle lunge to his right, he would have been on the outside of his opponent's left zwerg. In this position, when he was coming around to try to throw that right zwerg, chances are he still would have been hit. But he probably would have been hit in the side of the head and at the back of the head because that step to the right would have re-squared his shoulders and his hips and kept him facing forward. Most importantly of all, though, that if he was the fastest man alive and somehow knew what was going to happen, there was at least a decent chance that he was going to be able to get his right zwerg underneath of the left zwerg that was coming towards his head. And if you know anything about counter-zwerging, aka zwerging in order to stop another zwerg, the most important factor is who gets underneath of who. So, this is the three-step process. If you go in, you get parried on the left side, don't do that. That sucks. But if you do, try to go into a grapple. But if you really don't want to go into a grapple, take a step offline to the opposite side that you just got parried to. Again, to your right if you got parried to the left if you got parried to the right. And you're going to find that you're not going to be exposing the back of your head anymore, and you're not going to get slobber knockered so hard as this guy did. So for this next exchange, we have actually a pretty simple one. Jonas lands an absolutely beautiful stab straight to the chest. But the thing to talk about in this exchange is not what Jonas does, but what Steffen does. Now, I want to make a little bit of a reference here to a video I did, I think, 3 ago, where at Casey Swordstrong, Michael Stack, I believe, was doing a very good job of standing in these low left, like boar's tooth style guards and getting really nice short edge deflections. And one of the things I said in that video is that it is simultaneously an opening or a bait when you stand in this guard, one in which you have to know for sure that you are fast enough and have the right timing in order to set whatever is going to come at you aside. And as you can see here, there's a little bit of a deviation in how Steffen does his short edge deflections and how we saw Michael Stack doing his short edge deflections. And that difference is key to the reason why it was working for Michael and it's not working for Steffen. So when we watch this exchange, what we see here is that Stefan is standing in his low left boar's tooth, as we know, and the second Jonas comes in with his thrust, Stefan does attempt to do a bit of a short edge deflection, but there is a key difference. And the key difference is that when Stefan does his short edge deflection, he comes up with his short edge, and then right as about he gets to the level of his hips or the middle of his chest, he turns his hands into a cron position. He turns his 45-degree angle crossguard into a 90 perfectly horizontal degree crossguard. And this is a big problem. One thing I talk about when I talk about cron guard is that it's really, really good at setting things off when you're already in the position of a cron guard. If you're in a long point or some kind of plow, usually cron guard is more than enough because of the distance you have to travel is minimized. When you are in a boar's tooth, however, the distance you have to travel to pull off a cron guard is significantly larger. And as a result, as he was coming up with the short edge deflection, rather than continuing his momentum at that 45-degree angle, which probably would have maybe saved him, he instead turns it from a 45-degree angle motion to a perfectly vertical motion. And what this means is that he essentially has to drag Jonas's tip from the center of his chest all the way up his own face before he is safe. At the exact same time, he does not move backwards, which means that he doesn't give himself any real amount of time to get his blade into presence to get this proper parry. As a result, he ends up in a very classic situation that we used to see in the long point days where you get stabbed in the chest, you get locked in, and you immediately realize, oh no, my opponent just stabbed the crap out of me and I got stuck in the bind. Quick, pull off and throw something as a follow-up. That is, of course, what happens here. Stefan gets caught in the lockup, pulls off, throws a little bit of like a right Unterswerk to try to just get something out of it. And as a result, Jonas is already running past him and he kind of loses his sword a little bit. So he lands it, but I don't think anyone's going to call this as a valid afterblow. As a result, if you really want to be doing these short edge deflections, you have to make 100% sure that you commit to the short edge deflection as it is written, and you can't try to turn it into that cron parry idea because, as you can see here, there's a bit of a flaw. So I'm going to show this exchange, even though it's not particularly interested, and Stefan just gets nailed in the back of the head again, particularly because it actually showcases something that I just talked about earlier about advice and what you can do to not get Zwerked in the back of the head. And ironically, Stefan does everything that I said. Well, almost everything. So in this exchange, Stefan goes in once again for an absolutely massive ballistic thrust and commits so much momentum forward that he is completely unable to stop himself from borderline running out of the ring just in time to get parried and Zwerked in the back of the head again. But there are some key differences between this exchange and the last one that we saw. One, Jonas throws a right Zwerkau instead of a left Zwerkau. And the only reason he's able to throw this right Zwerkau is because of the key component that Stefan missed that was in my advice on how to not get Zwerked in the back of the head. One, he commits forward with a big thrust. Great, nothing really wrong with that. B, he gets parried off to his right side this time, which is theoretically the good side to get parried on. And I'm still doubling down on that. That is the good side to get parried on. However, as a result of getting parried onto Jonas's left side, he of course throws a right Zwerk. Now, normally, as I said before, when you throw a right Zwerk in a grapple situation, you often get stuffed. And the problem here is that there was no grapple. And there was no grapple because Stefan had committed so heavily to this thrust that he was concentrating all of his mental and physical effort to not falling over as opposed to doing anything. So as a result, when he misses his thrust or he just gets parried, he spends all of his time trying to get his feet under him and throwing his hand into that right quadrant, which is where he was getting smacked the entire time up till now. As a result, he offers up no defense and gets nailed in the back of the head on the opposite side. So I'm going to amend my advice somewhat. A, just because you get parried on the right side rather than the left side doesn't mean you're not able to expose the back of your head. It's just harder. B, you really need to go for these grapples. Just the fact that everything would have been different if Stefan had just collided with Jonas. He would not have been hit in the back of the head. He probably wouldn't have been hit at all. They both would have just fallen out of the ring and fallen onto each other like a sumo match. Great, whatever. It's still not the greatest idea to commit this hard to a thrust, especially if you can't handle the momentum after you're trying to stop. But at the same time, if all you did was add a grapple to this situation, you probably would have gotten away with it scot-free. And 3, great, I'm really glad that you threw your hand up into that upper right quadrant. The issue with throwing it just there is that it actually has everything to do with the move that you think your opponent is throwing. When you're right-handed, you really don't have the option of crossing your body and putting it up in your left area. You have to pretty much do that with your left hand. And the thing about trying to stop someone who's trying to Zwerk you in the head is that if all you do is throw your hand out there, well, you just fed your hand to the blow. However, in this instance, I would say it's actually preferable to feed your left hand to a right Zwerk rather than get hit in the back of the head. So, again, if you want to not be in this situation, remember, don't get parried on the left side. Please, for the love of God, grapple. And B, C, F, please, please, please stop ballistic thrusting so hard that you basically have no choice but to fall over. This is going to be now the final exchange that I cover, but it is actually the second to last exchange. And the reason I want to cover it is that it's a really, really nice exchange for Steffen right up until the end. And of course, I don't want to cover the last one because it's a one-handed cut that just hits the point cap and not very interesting. So in this particular exchange, we see some really, really great adaptations from Steffen, particular to what has been going wrong for him this whole time. Now, if you go back over the exchanges, what has been going wrong for Steffen is that every single time he goes for one of his ballistic thrusts, he gets parried and Zwerked in the head, and about 50% of the time, the back of the head. So, not looking great. So, what do you do to adapt to that? Well, the reason you're ballistic thrusting, of course, is you're trying to overwhelm your opponent's defense. And Steffen, as I pointed out, is much taller. So there's actually a fairly decent chance that these ballistic thrusts could overwhelm the defense of a shorter person, because it's just kind of how physics works. If you can start it from a longer distance, they might not be able to realize that you're coming in for that ballistic thrust too early. And the more energy you put into your thrust, the further distance you travel and the further away you can start. But at the end of the day, Jonas is just not falling for it. So the adaptations you need to make are two things. One, you need to play the medium range right at the end of your distance tippy-tappy parry riposte game. Why? When you are taller and you have a longer reach, what this essentially means is that you can fight at the range where you are able to parry and riposte very effectively, but you're technically fencing at a range where your opponent can only really parry and can't necessarily reach you outside of your arms with any of their follow-up attacks. You have to imagine it like boxing. In boxing, they talk about it like the pocket. It's the distance in which you fight where both people's arms can reach. However, just like in boxing, people with really long arms tend to do really well in the pocket because your pocket has like this overlap distance with their pocket. There's distances where you're in the pocket and they're not. And there's distances where they're in the pocket, but you are definitely also in the pocket. So you need to fence to that range. You need to put yourself in that situation. And we see Steffen get himself in that situation. There are several exchanges here where Steffen comes forward, gestures with a little bit of attack, Jonas backs up. He has to because he's not in his correct range. You see an exchange here where Jonas comes in with a little bit of an attack, Steffen backs up, gets the parry, throws a repost, and Jonas can't really hang there. He can't go in. He can't overcommit. He finds that every time he goes in, Steffen can just take a step backwards, maintain that range, maintain that pocket, and stay there and be very comfortable, while Jonas has to constantly move in and out of what is considered his or not his pocket because he just can't get past that tip. He can't get past that sword. Whenever you throw ballistic thrusts, you are basically throwing a Hail Mary where you say, either I land this or I'm now going to be well past my pocket and everyone's pocket and no one's going to be where they want to be. Either that or you're just going to stand there defensively and you're inviting your opponent to come do the wacky stuff to you instead. So this is really the place where you want that fencing to be. And of course, once we get to the end of the exchange here, we also see this pocket rule violated. Right at the end of this, Steffen and Jonas are basically standing still with their swords touching. This is, in my opinion, basically right on the edge of the range that Steffen wants to be at, but it's definitely not close enough for the range that Jonas wants to be at. And we see this play out almost exactly the way it's been predicted. Jonas takes this little half shuffle step forward. Steffen does not move backwards, thus meaning that they have both now entered each other's danger zones. Steffen has lost the advantage, and immediately upon doing this, both Steffen and Jonas attempt to thrust one another, and Jonas gets the center line. Jonas wins. He gets the nice clean thrust, and Steffen gets nothing. Why did this happen? Because exactly when they were at the point where Steffen had his best advantage, he let his opponent simply take that half step forward and leave it. he let his opponent remove his advantage. And once his advantage was gone, he had no real hope of getting a clean exchange. There was definitely a version of reality here where they simply doubled each other, but as you can see by the score, that's not something that Steffen can be affording right now. So he has to put himself in that pocket range. He has to give himself the one advantage that he clearly has. And while we see it almost pay off in this exchange, ultimately it does not, because he just doesn't capitalize. So that's the end of the fight. There's, again, one last exchange where Jonas just gets a one-handed cut and wins on the point cap of 10 points, and that is going to be it. So a cool exchange, a cool fight. Definitely some advice to be given to Steffen as far as his exposing the back of the head problem, but not one in which either fencer had, you know, one game plan that they just executed the whole time. Jonas definitely got the better of the parry riposte exchanges, but there were definitely a couple of exchanges where he was the aggressor and was able to really capitalize on some mistakes that Steffen had made earlier as well. So great fight, great adaptations, a lot to learn from, and I will see you next week with another video.